meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. It's wonderful to see all of you on this Mother's Day in spite of the weather. I'm glad if you're visiting us, I'm glad that you're here and welcome. We have other members who are off visiting their family in other places and other celebrations happening. I hope that the day brings you some joy and happiness. And if, for whatever reason, if your mother lives far away or has passed on or other difficult circumstances, that this is a difficult day, please know that you are in our prayers and that we hope that you will find comfort. Today on the church calendar, it's Good Shepherd Sunday, and every year on the fourth Sunday after Easter, we spend some time reflecting on the image of God and Jesus as the Good Shepherd. It's an image that connected with the early church because they knew a lot of shepherds, and it's an image that connects with us now. There's a reason that that image was chosen and not maybe God the rancher. God the good rancher. Ranchers who raise cattle, raise cows, they herd cows from behind. You sort of make loud noises and you kind of push cattle forward. You try and do that with sheep, they just run around and they get behind you. Sheep want to be led. A stranger can wander in the middle of a herd of cattle and the cattle will pay no attention. Similarly, the rancher can show up and the cattle will pay no attention to them either. They don't have any special relationship with the rancher. Not so with shepherds. Sheep know who their shepherd is. They can tell by the sound of their footsteps, by the sounds that they make, by the way that they move. If a stranger shows up in the middle of a flock of sheep, pandemonium will break out because the sheep do not know them. You can still see shepherds and sheep today in Israel, around Jerusalem, in the rural areas. Bedouin shepherds will bring their small flocks of sheep, maybe 8 to 12 sheep, to watering holes, and there'll be many shepherds with many flocks, and they'll gather together to a big convention of sheep all milling around at the watering hole. And when it's time to go home, each of the shepherds will make some sort of sound, a signal that their flock knows is the signal for them to follow them home. It could be a whistle or some kind of yell or some chirp or clicking of the tongue. The sheep know the sound of their shepherd's voice. They know the signals. They have ways of communicating back and forth. And they will follow their shepherd home. So the big confusion of sheep will split off back into their own flock. And that is the image that Jesus is relying on today as he answers the question of the crowd in the temple. John tells us that it is the Feast of Dedication, which we know today as Hanukkah, the Feast of the Rededication of the temple. Jesus is walking in the portico of Solomon, the oldest and most sacred part of the temple, and a crowd gathers around him and asks him, "How long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Messiah, tell us plainly." They want a yes or no answer to a simple, in their minds, question. Are you or are you not the Messiah? And Jesus declines to answer, and I can think of it for at least two reasons he doesn't want to answer this question. The first one is, he knows that the kind of Messiah the crowd has in mind is nothing like the kind of Messiah that he has come to be. The crowd is thinking about a Messiah as a political and a military leader. Jesus has no intention of being that kind of Messiah. Similarly, the crowd has no interest in the kind of Messiah that Jesus comes to be. So rather than get into a long argument with the crowd, he decides not to answer. Additionally, he knows that if he does answer that question, either yes or no, is just going to lead to more conversation, more questions, more debate. If he says he is the Messiah, then the crowd's going to want to know why he's doing all these things that don't seem like things that Messiah should do. If he says he isn't the Messiah, they're going to ask him about all the claims he makes about himself. He's coming from God, and how it is that he does all these miraculous things that he does. Jesus doesn't want more conversation. Additionally, he knows that if the crowd had really been paying attention, if the crowd had been listening to his sermons, listening to his teachings, watching his interactions with the people he comes in contact with, watching the healing that he brings to people who are sick, that that they would already know the answer to this question. And so he says to them, I have told you, and you do not believe. The works that I do in my Father's name testify to me, but you do not believe, because you do not belong to my sheep. My sheep hear my voice. I know them, and they follow me. In essence, he says to the crowd, look at the shepherds. Look over the wall of the temple. Look at the shepherds there in the pastures around Jerusalem. Look at how those sheep follow their shepherds without having to ask questions. Those are my followers, not you all who are trying to debate finer points. It's a compelling image of the sheep knowing the sound of their shepherd's voice. As I was thinking about this week, I was remembering that when I was a kid in elementary school, we lived in Midland, Michigan, on the edge of a relatively new housing development. And my sisters and I had friends in the neighborhood behind our house, and there were just 2 or 3 more houses, and then woods and fields, undeveloped land. And we would go out in the afternoon and play. We'd wander around the woods, we'd play in the fields, and towards dinner time, you'd start hearing shouts from various houses. My friends' mothers would be calling, Brian! Brian! Whatever their names were. And then at some point, you would hear this shrill, very loud, piercing whistle. That was my mother. We had this fail-safe way of getting us back home. She would stick her head out the back door, and she still has it today, this piercing whistle that carried some distance. And that was the signal that it was time for us to go home. And not time for us to get ready to go home or to think about going home. It was time for us to go home. And it was really, as I think back on it, was a pretty ingenious system, because I don't recall us ever having a discussion about how far away from the house we were allowed to play, how far deep into those woods we could go. But we knew we needed to be able to hear her whistle so that we would know when it was time to come back. Similarly, Jesus knows that the people who are paying attention to him know what his voice sounds like, they know who he is, they know what his teachings mean, they know what his preaching means, they know what his interactions with other people mean. They're already following him. I think at heart, the problem that the crowd and Jesus have is almost one of semantics. What does it mean to believe something? The crowd wants a yes or no answer. That's a kind of belief. It's a series of statements that I can say are either true or false, that I believe are true or I believe are false. I can give my intellectual assent to those statements. Jesus is looking for a different kind of belief. Jesus is looking for the kind of belief that faiths into who Jesus is, that changes people's lives, that changes people's actions, that shows them a new way to live. That isn't a series of yes or no statements, but is rather a way of life, a way of living this life, a way of living a renewed, resurrected life. So I want to leave you today with 2 questions. I ask you to reflect on whose voice brought you here today. And not just this morning. Some of you may be here because it's what you do on Mother's Day, and welcome, I'm glad you're here. But for many of us, this journey started decades ago, when our mothers, fathers, our grandparents, our aunts and uncles, our Sunday school teachers, clergy, our friends, brought us to church, brought us up in the faith, drew us in. We followed their voice and came here, and we're still following their voices today. Spend some time reflecting on who those voices are. What voice brought you here today? And then reflect a bit on whose voice will you follow as you leave here today. It's wonderful to gather and worship on Sunday morning, to be the gathered people of God. And it is wonderful to hear God's voice, not only drawing us here, but drawing us back out into the world, into our lives, along a new and renewed path, a path of grace, a path of love, a path that will renew this world. Whose voice are you following back out into the world today? I pray that you will reflect on these questions, that they may bring you good memories, good comfort. I reflect that they will help you to identify the path that God would have you walk, to identify the gifts that God has given you to walk that path, and that you will find the strength and the courage to do what God has called you to do.